Welcome back. This video is about making the accessories that will aid you in turning effective spheres between centers. For that, you're going to need a drive center that can be put into the headstock to drive the piece, and you're going to need a device that fits into the tailstock. Well, this version is easy to make. I'm going to spend this video showing you how I made the adapter here that fits the one-way jet or other brands of life centers that use a 3/4 10 threaded insert. So we're going to go to the lathe. I'll show you the steps in making both of these, and we'll come back and conclude this short video. Before I make the accessories, I wanted to show you how I'm going to do it. This is going to be the headstock piece, and we need to put a Morse taper on this, a Morse taper 2. Well, if you look at the definition of it, I went to my machinist handbook, and Morse taper has 50 thousandths taper per inch, 50 thousandths inch per inch. It's 2 9/16 long. At the fattest, it's 700 thousandths, and at the smallest, 5782 10 thousandths. Yeah, that's too much. What I'm going to do is simply this. I'm going to take this blank, put it between centers, and I'm going to measure how long I want that taper to go. For instance, if I only want to go to about here, then I'm going to measure and mark it off. So I'm going to take this diameter and turn it here, and I'm going to take this diameter up here and turn it here using my parting tool and just taper those two together. Then I'm going to take and stick this into the headstock and create the funny little cup thing on the other end. This one I dished out, and I put some sandpaper in here with super glue for a little grip. This one, as I said earlier, I just used some rubber cement to create a kind of sticky thing. So I have two of them, and I'm going to make them this long because that's how long a piece of maple I had, and it'll be just fine. So I'm going to take the maple, put it between centers. I put a small spur drive in here, something that's going to dig into the end of the piece of the wood fine. Get it up between centers. Be sure it's locked in tight. And all I'm going to do now is just turn it around fairly quickly. I'm going to use my shallow fluted gouge for this. Just because it's at hand. I could have gone to a spindle roughing gouge at this point if I'd wanted to. Nevertheless. So we've got it down to just round, and it's a rough round at that. So we're going to take it out of between centers. I'm going to measure the Morse taper life center that I showed you in the last clip. And I've measured where I think the length is going to be. And we're going to turn the end on our side down to that dimension. And I don't remember what it is, but it's what's on those calipers. So we got that one down to size. Now we have to lay out the length that we want, and then take that measurement from that live center and turn that end of the taper down to the dimension. So once those two tapers are in place, all I now have to do is simply connect the dotted line, and I'm going to take my shallow fluted gouge and turn that taper from one diameter to the next. So once that has done, it doesn't have to be cleaned up a great deal. You could sand it if you want to, but rough is also good for getting a good grip on the taper and the headstock later on. So I'm just pulling it down to those dimensions. I want to be fairly close on this. If it doesn't fit quite right, a piece of 80 grit sandpaper in the right locations could take care of any little difficulties. So we've got it down to shape. Got a good grip on that, actually. Left a nice little hole. So we'll take that spur drive out, and now we're going to place the new drive center in the headstock, and I'm going to use the tailstock to push it up and press it in. And once it's been pressed in and locked tightly, all I now have to do is to shape the tip of this. I can take a little mass off. I think it's a little long, so I'm going to shorten it a little bit after I trude it. And once it's cut to length, then what I need to do is simply dish out the end of it so that it is cup shaped and will fit around the size ball that we want. Now, if you're doing larger spheres, you would want a larger end on this, and I'm typically doing small ones, so this is going to be just fine. And once I have the shape on this cut, then what I'll end up doing is taking it out and finding a proper abrasive material that I can place on the face of this so I get a good grip. The 80 grit sandpaper that I glued to one of the other ones seems to work really, really well. And if it gets worn or torn, it can always be easily replaced. The sandpaper could be put on with CA glue, could be put on with rubber cement, either way. So that is the drive center. Well, let's start off with another piece of maple. Little square block, we'll put it between centers. And first thing to do is to mark them off, set it up between centers. And then what we're going to do is turn it round with a spindle roughing gouge. Just get this back into general shape. So once it's got round, then the next thing we're going to do is we are going to chuck this in a standard 4-jaw chuck from one end, the purpose of which is to give us access to the opposite end, which needs to be drilled and tapped. So we're going to remove our spare drive, install a 4-jaw chuck. We're going to use a chuck with number 1 jaws, which are the ones that are of the right size to fit the project we're going to be working with. So we're just going to center it loosely in the jaws, tighten the jaws just enough to keep it from falling out, and we're going to try to put it back into that same hole that the live center was in when we were turning between centers. That'll give us the best possible lining up that we can do at this point. So back between centers, make sure that live center is positioned in the hole, and once that is done, then what we'll do is tighten the jaws around the stem. We can't trust that either end at this point is flat. So back between centers, solidly secured, and now we are putting a Jacob's chuck in with a centering drill, the purpose of which is simply to create a centered hole in that spindle into which we will then drill. Use this many times in pin turning to be sure our hole is very accurately centered. So now, using the same Jacob's chuck, we've now installed the correct drill bit for a 3/4 10 thread, and we will drill this hole to the depth that will allow us to seat the threads on the shoulder of the one-way live center. As you can see on the drill bit, I placed a mark that will allow us to drill deep enough to thread all the way to the bottom and assure that this will sit tightly on the one-way live center. Now, even though this is dry maple, it's still important that we keep the speed down and that we stop, clear the sawdust, backing out, breaking the chips, and then completing the drilling all the way to the bottom of the hole. Now, as I withdraw this bit, the interesting thing is, as you will see, this is very dry maple, and look how the chips still have expanded and filled the flutes of the drill. Well, enough of that. Drill bit out. And now we're going to set up to use that same Jacob's chuck. And in it we've installed a spring-loaded live center that is specific for aligning taps, when we drill a hole. The tap goes into the center of the hole like that. The follower goes into the little indent in the bottom, and that keeps the tap perfectly aligned with the hole while we tighten it. I'm using a small crescent wrench just to give me a handhold, and we're turning the threads, backing off to break the thread cutting. And once we got all the way to the bottom, then we back it out, always moving the tap follower so we don't end up bottoming into it and tearing the threads. If you wanted to throw a little CA glue on these threads and stiffen them and then recut a second time, that's not a bad idea. I've done that on the oak. I did not do it here on the maple. So now it's been threaded. The hole is square and lined, but that face, we don't know that it is dead square. So now what we're going to do is take our shallow fluted gouge, come up and simply make sure that that face is running flat. As you can see, the whole spindle is a little off alignment, but we'll fix that. So right now we're just giving us a nice flat shoulder, because the next thing we're going to do is take this out of the chuck, reverse it, put that flat surface against the base of the chuck body. Not a good reference surface, but it's good enough for what we need. That's going to go all the way to the bottom. We've measured how deep those threads are and know where they end. So we'll tighten this back up again. The piece of wood we have on here is a little longer than what we need. So one of the first things we're going to do is, after we get this tightened in here, just shorten it to a good workable length. Any length works for you. I find shorter is always a little stiffer, a little bit better. So with the parting tool, we're just going to cut this off to what we think is an appropriate length. Hanging on only one end, still using overlapping cuts, not a heck of a lot of pressure because we're not supported on both ends. And if you had a center in the near end, when that got cut off, it could go flying. So we part down to the center. This piece that's coming off will be waste. It's gone. So let's flatten that up just a little bit here. Now this is going to be where the ball will set. So let's shape it down. Now I have a tendency to turn smaller spheres, and by doing so I don't need this to be too large. You're going to size this to whatever size project you work on. So we're shaping it down, and now the center needs to be shaped sort of like a bowl. The point is, the outside edge is the only thing that's going to be touching your sphere, holding it in place and holding in alignment. So we're going to reduce the center so that we'll not be touching that surface. That's been cleared out. Make sure that edge is nice and square. And that end is virtually done. We probably will retrue it one more time, but for right now, that's good enough. So let's take this out, screw it onto our one-way live center, which is mounted in the tailstock, and that puts it into the position it's going to be used. And we want to turn on it, but it's a live center, so we need to support it. I'm going to close down the jaws of the chuck and just press the new drive center into those jaws, just enough to drive it. We're not tightening on it, but now we have a chance to true up the outside edge. Couple 3 strokes with our shallow fluted gouge. We could put some decoration on there if we wanted to, but basically I just want it to be nice and true. It clears the edges off, and now the base has been squared. The walls have been squared to the base, and we're going to put it back in the chuck one last time to true up those edges. One last time after this cut. So turn the lathe off. We're going to remove this from the live center, reverse it into the 4-jaw chucks one more time. There's a good fit, nice tight threads, seated well. So open the jaws. We're going to again seat it all the way on the bottom of the chuck body, below the length of the jaws. That means we are holding it on an edge and a base that are as square as we can get. So right now our job only is to square up the shoulder and check again to be sure that the edge is exactly what we want it to be. So one last little light pass here just to true that up. It could be sanded and cleaned up a little bit if you like, but I find it's not necessary. So that edge is done. Touch it one more time, and we're done. So now we have a device that can be screwed onto our live center to support a sphere while it's being rotated and its shadow's being turned away. That screws right onto there. Well, I hope this little short video we just did was helpful in giving you accessories that'll make it easier for you to turn. You can always go to the specifications for a Morris taper and turn to these numbers, but I found it much simpler to simply take a taper, measure it, and match it. Hope this little extra video has been useful. We'll see you in the next lesson. Stay safe, subscribe, and in the next lesson we will be turning finials. See you in the next lessons.